Hotels are meant to be places of rest and comfort, temporary sanctuaries where weary travelers can find respite from the world outside. But what happens when the walls are steeped in dark history, where supernatural forces lurk just beyond the door, and where survival depends on following a set of bizarre, cryptic rules? These stories explore the terrifying side of hospitality, where breaking even the smallest rule can unleash horrors beyond imagination. I always thought working the night shift at the hotel would be easy money. Sure, it was a little creepy, but sitting behind a polished desk, checking in the occasional late guest, and staring at the muted glow of the computer screen wasn't exactly hard labor. Most nights were quiet, and that's exactly how I liked it. The Halloween decorations had been up for a week. Tasteful, not tacky. Pumpkins sat in clusters around the lobby, their faces cheerfully carved but already beginning to shrivel from the dry air. There was a small haunted house set up for kids earlier that afternoon, the remnants of which still lingered. A forgotten plastic spider on the check-in desk, and a cardboard tombstone by the fireplace. The usual seasonal vibe. Nothing particularly thrilling. Around 11 p.m., the phone rang. That was unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes people called down for fresh towels or to complain about noise. The line crackled as I answered. "Front desk, how can I assist you? I need to get to the 13th floor." The voice was clipped, almost impatient. My mind immediately jumped to the hotel manual and its one weird rule that had stuck out to me on my first day. Do not take guests to the 13th floor. It was a joke, surely. There wasn't even a 13th floor. Just like most hotels, we skipped that number. The elevators went from 12 to 14. Some old superstition, I guessed. People didn't like staying on a floor with unlucky connotations, so the designers just skipped it to avoid complaints. I wasn't superstitious myself, but it still seemed like a strange thing to demand. "Sorry, we don't have a 13th floor," I said with a small laugh, hoping to lighten the awkwardness. There was silence on the other end, a silence that felt too deliberate. After a moment, the voice spoke again, lower this time. "You're mistaken. I need to get to the 13th floor." I hesitated, caught between brushing the guy off and considering if I'd misunderstood something about the hotel. I'd never had anyone ask to go to a floor that didn't exist before. My eyes wandered over to the security monitors, all of them showing empty hallways or dimly lit sections of the lobby. It wasn't busy tonight. Definitely no reason to escalate something so trivial. I'm really sorry, but there's no 13th floor. Are you sure you're at the right hotel?" I asked, though I knew that was a pointless question. "I'm at the right place. I'll meet you by the elevators in 5 minutes," the voice said, and then the line went dead. I stared at the phone, unsettled by how casually the stranger had brushed off my response. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank or someone messing with me, but something about his tone, so steady, almost too calm, made me uneasy. I wasn't about to lose my job over a ghost story, though. If this guy showed up, I'd just explain it again, face to face. Problem solved. I got up from my chair and walked over to the elevator bay, listening to the faint hum of the lobby's ambient music and the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. A slow night like this should have been peaceful, but suddenly, it felt stifling. When I reached the elevators, I leaned against the wall, waiting. A couple of minutes passed and no one appeared. Maybe he was on a different floor or had given up. Either way, I figured the strange call was over. But then the elevator doors slid open with a faint ding. The man standing inside was tall and wore a dark suit. His face was sharp, clean-cut, but his eyes were wrong. Something about them felt off, like they were too deep, as if he'd seen something no one else had. He looked at me, and for a moment, I felt like I was the one intruding. "You're here," I managed to say, unsure of how to even begin the conversation. "Take me to the 13th floor," he repeated, his voice steady, unwavering. The way he said it made it seem like it wasn't even a request, more of an expectation. "Listen," I started. "We don't have a 13th floor here. The elevators go from 12 to 14. It's just how the building's set up." His gaze didn't waver, and for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to look away either. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "The 13th floor is there. You just haven't seen it." The words shouldn't have meant anything. They shouldn't have gotten under my skin. But standing in front of him, in that moment, it felt like the air was thinning out, like something invisible was pressing down on my chest. I shifted my weight, clearing my throat, trying to shake off the unease. "I'm serious, sir. There is no 13th floor," I said, more firmly this time. "If you need help with something else, I'd be happy to assist, but I can't take you to a floor that doesn't exist." Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to me, his expression still unreadable. "Read this," he said, stepping out of the elevator and walking past me into the lobby. I stood there for a moment, staring at the folded paper in my hand. It was old, the edges yellowed, like it had been handled too many times. My fingers hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded it. It was a list of rules, typed neatly in faded black ink. Rule 1. Do not speak of the 13th floor. Rule 2. If someone asks for the 13th floor, do not take them. Rule 3. If you find yourself on the 13th floor, do not attempt to leave. I blinked, reading the list again. That couldn't be right. Was this some kind of sick joke? But before I could process what I was holding, the man was back, standing right behind me. He had moved so quietly, I hadn't heard a single footstep. "Take me to the 13th floor," he repeated, his voice now carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my hand reached out toward the elevator panel. My hand hovered over the elevator panel for a moment, trembling just slightly. I didn't know why I was about to press the button, but it felt like a reflex, like something deep in me already knew where this was heading. The man stood still beside me, his presence unnervingly calm, as if waiting for me to follow through on something we both knew was wrong. I glanced back at the list of rules still crumpled in my hand. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Rule 2. If someone asks for the 13th floor, do not take them. I should have stopped. I should have turned around, gone back to the front desk, and left him standing there. But something in his stare, his eerie patience, made it impossible for me to walk away. Before I could stop myself, I pressed the button for the 12th floor. The elevator doors closed with a soft hiss, sealing us inside the small metal box. The man said nothing, just stood behind me in a silence that felt too deliberate. The elevator moved up, each floor ticking by slowly, 10, 11, 12, and then it stopped. There was no ding, no sound of gears clicking into place. It just halted mid-floor, the lights inside flickering once, then twice, before going out completely. My stomach dropped as we were plunged into darkness. "Must be a glitch," I muttered under my breath, though I didn't believe it. I fumbled for the emergency button on the panel, but my fingers couldn't find it. The buttons had disappeared, the panel completely smooth beneath my touch. That's when I felt it, the shift, the subtle jolt of the elevator resuming its climb. But now it was moving slower, much slower. The feeling in the pit of my stomach was undeniable. We weren't going to the 14th floor. It was taking us somewhere else. I turned toward the man, but I couldn't see him in the darkness. Yet, I felt his presence. It filled the elevator, cold and heavy, like the air was thickening around us. My breath quickened, and I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The elevator shuddered to a stop, and I felt a faint sense of weightlessness, as though the ground beneath me had shifted. The doors slid open with an unsettling smoothness, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. It wasn't the 14th floor. The walls were an old peeling beige, with dark stains trailing from the ceiling to the carpeted floor. The light overhead flickered erratically, casting weak pools of yellow light that barely reached the corners. The hallway stretched long and narrow, vanishing into shadow. This isn't possible," I whispered, more to myself than to the man, who was already stepping out of the elevator. His shoes made no sound against the faded carpet. He moved with purpose, his steps confident, as though he had been here before, as though he knew this place intimately. I stood frozen at the threshold, my pulse racing, my legs refusing to move. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to press the button for the lobby, and leave this entire nightmare behind. But the elevator doors stayed open, like an invitation, daring me to follow. He didn't look back, not once. He just walked down the hall, disappearing into the shadows at the far end. There was something hypnotic in his stride, something that made me believe I had no other choice. The rules on the list burned in my mind, but they felt distant now, like a warning I had chosen to ignore long ago. Before I could stop myself, I stepped out into the hallway. The air was different here, thick and damp, like it hadn't been circulated in years. A faint odor of mildew clung to the walls, but underneath that, there was something else. A scent that made my stomach turn. Decay, or worse. The doors lining the hallway were closed, their numbers faded and barely legible, but I knew this wasn't the 12th floor or the 14th. This was something in between, a place that shouldn't exist but did, hidden just out of sight. The 13th floor. The man had vanished around the corner, leaving me alone in this unnatural silence. I stood there, listening, straining to hear something, anything. But there was nothing. No hum of air conditioning, no distant chatter of guests in their rooms, not even the faint creaks of an old building. It was like the entire hotel had fallen away, leaving me in some hollow, forgotten place. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but when I looked over my shoulder, the elevator doors were gone. The wall behind me was solid, unbroken. Panic surged through me, and I rushed forward, my footsteps now the only sound echoing down the corridor. I turned the corner, expecting to see the man, but the hallway stretched on, empty. My mind raced. Maybe there was a stairwell. Maybe if I kept moving, I could find a way out. I started walking faster, my eyes darting to the faded room numbers. Each door I passed felt like it was watching me, like there was something behind them, waiting. Then I saw it. A door halfway down the hall stood slightly ajar, the number etched into the brass plate above it barely visible. 1313. The dim light overhead flickered again, casting the door in shadow before illuminating it once more. The urge to move toward it was overwhelming. I knew better. Every instinct told me not to. But something was drawing me closer. It was as if the very air around the door was pulling me in. I hesitated, my hand reaching out slowly, fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold wood. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed it open just enough to peer inside. The room beyond was dark, but the faintest glimmer of light spilled in from the hallway, revealing a space that looked wrong. The bed was disheveled, the sheets torn and frayed at the edges. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing mold-blackened plaster beneath. And there was a smell, thick, suffocating, like something had been rotting inside for far too long. Then, in the far corner, just outside the reach of the light, something shifted. My heart lurched in my chest as I stepped back instinctively. Whatever was in that room, I wasn't supposed to see it. Not yet. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a presence, something watching, waiting. Before I could take another step back, I heard the elevator's ding behind me. My head snapped toward the sound, and there it was. The elevator doors open, the same man standing inside, his gaze fixed on me. "Come inside," he said, his voice echoing softly down the hall. "You've seen enough." I hesitated for a moment longer, my pulse racing, before I moved toward the elevator. The moment I stepped inside, the doors slid shut, and the elevator began to descend. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as the silence between us stretched on. I didn't dare ask what had just happened or where I had been. But as the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened to the familiar lobby, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. When the elevator doors slid open into the lobby, I stepped out and breathed in deeply. The air felt different, real, like I'd been underwater and was now breaking the surface. But even as I stood there, staring at the familiar front desk and the now empty lobby, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me down. The man in the suit didn't exit the elevator with me. I glanced back, expecting him to step out, but the doors had closed silently behind me. The floor display above the elevator was blank, no numbers lighting up to show where it was going, or if it had gone anywhere at all. My eyes darted to the panel, but the 13th floor wasn't listed, as it shouldn't have been. It was as if the entire incident had never happened, but I knew better. Shakily, I returned to the front desk and sank into my chair, feeling like I'd just run a marathon. The list of rules was still in my hand, crumpled now, the paper soft from my sweating grip. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I barely noticed the sound of the hotel phone ringing again. I jumped, startled out of my thoughts, and grabbed the receiver with a trembling hand. Front desk. There was a long pause, and then the same voice from before, the man's voice, spoke again, calmly, as if we hadn't just gone through that ordeal. "You broke the second rule." My stomach clenched, and I gripped the phone tighter. "What are you talking about?" I stammered. "I didn't take you to the 13th floor. You took me there. I had no choice." The silence stretched on, but this time, it wasn't the empty static of a deadline. It was thick, deliberate, like he was considering his next words. Finally, he spoke. His voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "You took me there the moment you pressed the button." I froze, my mouth suddenly dry. The rule had been clear. If someone asks for the 13th floor, do not take them. And yet, somehow, I had taken him. The action, the intent, hadn't mattered. The outcome was what broke the rule, and now, what did that mean? "Listen," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever this is, I didn't. You broke the second rule," he repeated, cutting me off. "And now you'll break the third." My blood ran cold, and I could barely keep the phone steady as I gripped it. The third rule: if you find yourself on the 13th floor, do not attempt to leave. I'm not going back there, I whispered. Though even as the words left my lips, I knew it wasn't up to me. There's no escaping it. Once you've seen the 13th floor, you're part of it, he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. You'll go back. They always do. The line went dead with a soft click. I slammed the phone down and pushed away from the desk, pacing in tight circles behind it, trying to make sense of what was happening. The list of rules was still in my hand, mocking me with its cryptic warnings. My mind raced with 100 possibilities, but all of them ended in the same place, the 13th floor. It was like a black hole, pulling me toward it no matter how hard I fought to stay away. I sat down and forced myself to breathe, closing my eyes for a moment. The lobby around me was quiet, too quiet. I opened my eyes and glanced at the security monitors again, hoping to find comfort in the familiar sight of the empty hallways. But what I saw wasn't comforting. The camera feed for the 12th floor showed the hallway I had walked down not long ago, but there was something wrong. The light was flickering more violently now. The walls seemed to twist in subtle, unnatural ways. And the doors, each one that I had passed on my way to room 1313, were slightly open, dark shadows spilling out from behind them. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen. I hadn't seen anyone when I was up there. I hadn't even heard anything. But something had been in those rooms. Before I could process what I was seeing, the camera feed flickered, and for a split second, I saw the man in the suit standing at the far end of the hallway, facing the camera. He wasn't moving. He was just waiting. I gasped and blinked, and when the screen returned to normal, he was gone. My breath came in ragged bursts as I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave the hotel. Right now. Grabbing my keys from the desk, I rushed toward the lobby's entrance. The automatic doors slid open with their usual soft whoosh, and I stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze hitting me like a slap to the face. For a moment, I stood there, letting the reality of being outside ground me. But something wasn't right. The parking lot was empty. The streetlights, which usually cast a soft orange glow across the asphalt, were flickering, casting harsh, uneven shadows. I took a step forward and froze. The hotel. It looked wrong. The building was taller than it should have been. The windows on the upper floors were dark, almost black, and where the 14th floor should have been, I counted, an extra row. The 13th floor was there, visible now, as if it had always been a part of the building but was only revealing itself to me now. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. This wasn't right. I had left. I had followed the rules, hadn't I? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned slowly, instinctively knowing what I would see. The man in the suit stood behind me, too close, his expression still calm, still patient. "You can't leave," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You belong to the 13th floor now." My legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the pavement. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. All I could do was stand there, staring at the man as his words echoed in my head. "No," I whispered, barely able to find my voice. "I don't belong there." His eyes darkened, and he took a step closer, his presence suffocating. "You broke the rules," he said, and there was no hint of sympathy in his tone. And now you'll stay." I felt the world shift around me, the night sky above twisting and warping as the hotel loomed larger, its shadow swallowing everything in sight. The 13th floor was calling me, pulling me back, and no matter how hard I fought, no matter how much I resisted, I knew the truth. There was no escape. The next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the elevator again. The doors opened with a soft ding, revealing the dim, flickering interior. The man stepped inside, turning to face me, and gestured for me to follow. "You're coming with me," he said. And I realized then that I had never had a choice, not from the moment I had answered that first call. With a sinking heart, I stepped into the elevator, and the doors slid shut behind me. It was a long, tiring drive up the coast, the kind where the fatigue seeps into your bones. I was in no mood for adventure or complications, just a simple stopover before continuing on. The hotel had appeared out of nowhere, nestled between an old gas station and an empty lot. I almost missed it, an aging structure with peeling paint and a worn sign that simply read, "Westview Hotel." It wasn't flashy, but it promised a bed, a roof, and quiet. That was all I needed. I parked my car, feeling the weight of exhaustion press on my shoulders. The evening had settled into that deep orange glow where the sun dips low, casting the world in a fading warmth. The entrance to the hotel looked relatively normal, though something about it seemed old in a way that made it feel out of step with time. I walked inside, my shoes tapping lightly against the tiled floor of the lobby. The place felt deserted, with only the front desk standing under a dim yellow light. Behind the counter stood an older man with thin white hair and an unsettlingly placid smile. His name tag said Mr. Calthorpe. His face was calm, serene even, but his eyes carried a weight that made me hesitate. I was used to road-weary motels and roadside inns, but this felt different. There was something about this place that unsettled me, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "Just passing through?" he asked, his voice light but oddly resonant in the still air. I nodded. "Just for the night." He pulled out a set of keys, the metallic sound echoing through the empty lobby. As his hand hovered over the keys, he glanced at me with an almost imperceptible pause, and then, for reasons I didn't understand at the time, he chose an older key with a tarnished brass tag. The number 409 was etched into it. "Room 409, he said, sliding the key across the desk. "There's only one rule for that room." He paused, leaning in ever so slightly. "Do not look out the window after sunset." I laughed softly, thinking it was some kind of joke or quirky hotel tradition. But his expression remained grave. "You'll thank me for it," he added, his tone unmistakably serious. I took the key, curiosity gnawing at me as I headed toward the stairs. The elevator looked like it hadn't worked in years, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck in there, so the narrow stairwell was my best bet. As I climbed, I could feel the hotel's age. The walls were cracked, peeling in some places, the carpet worn down from what felt like decades of use. Yet the deeper I went into its corridors, the more unsettling it became. By the time I reached the 4th floor, an uncomfortable chill had settled over me. The hallway stretched ahead in a straight line, dim lights flickering slightly overhead. At the far end was room 409. I turned the key in the lock, hearing the old mechanism click before the door creaked open. The room itself was unremarkable. A simple bed, a small desk, a lamp. It looked like any other hotel room I'd seen before, if not a bit outdated. But the window, it stood on the far side of the room, framed by heavy curtains that were drawn shut. Something about the way they hung there, concealing the outside, gave me pause. I set my bag down, resisting the irrational urge to pull the curtains open. I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, it was just a window, just a simple view of the outside. Still, the warning from Mr. Calthorpe played on a loop in my head. Do not look out the window after sunset. I busied myself unpacking, pushing the thought of the window to the back of my mind. The sun was still clinging to the horizon, but I could tell it wouldn't last much longer. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, so I decided to head downstairs to find something to eat. I locked the door behind me and made my way back down to the lobby. Mr. Calthorpe was gone, replaced by a younger woman who gave me a polite nod as I passed by. I asked about nearby places for dinner, and she pointed me toward a diner a few blocks down. I took her suggestion, though I couldn't shake the lingering unease from the moment I'd stepped foot in this place. The streets outside were quiet as I walked. Too quiet. No cars passed, no sounds of life, just a hollow emptiness that pressed in around me. The diner itself was a relic from another time, with checkered floors and booths lined with worn leather. I ate quickly, my appetite diminished by the creeping sense of unease that had begun to follow me everywhere. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but something about the hotel and the strange rule hung heavy in my thoughts. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to be watching. By the time I returned, the sun had sunk below the horizon, leaving the sky a deepening shade of purple. The hotel seemed darker, colder somehow as I entered. The hallways felt longer, as though they stretched on endlessly. I shook the feeling off and made my way back to room 409. Once inside, I flipped on the lamp, grateful for the soft light it cast. Everything was as I'd left it, except the window. The heavy curtains swayed ever so slightly, though no breeze should have reached them. The air in the room felt denser, thick with an energy I couldn't explain. I stared at the curtains for what felt like hours, the words of the front desk clerk echoing in my mind. Don't look outside the window. A strange pull gnawed at me, urging me to approach, to see what lay beyond the thick fabric. But something inside me resisted. I shook my head, feeling foolish for letting it get to me. It was just a silly rule, a weird superstition, probably designed to add mystery to the place. Still, I couldn't shake the growing unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. I turned away from the window, forcing myself into bed. As I lay there, the room felt colder, and the distant sound of something faint, perhaps wind or something more, drifted through the walls. Despite the warmth of the blankets, I found myself shivering. I couldn't tell if it was from the chill or something else entirely. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of the room around me, as if it were watching, waiting. And behind me, the window seemed to call. Sleep came in restless bursts, punctuated by a persistent feeling of unease. Every time I drifted off, I would wake again, the room heavy with an unfamiliar weight. The strange stillness of room 409 seemed to amplify in the dark. There were no familiar sounds, a creaking floorboard, the hum of traffic in the distance, or even the distant murmur of a television. It was unnaturally quiet. I couldn't shake the thought of that window. It loomed in my mind like a forbidden temptation, drawing me toward it. The warning Mr. Calthorpe had given me kept replaying in my head, but with each passing minute, it felt less like a suggestion and more like an unspoken challenge. Why would anyone give such a bizarre rule in the first place? Surely it couldn't be that serious. The clock on the bedside table read 11:50 p.m. The night was inching toward midnight, the air growing colder by the second. It wasn't the typical chill of an old hotel room. This felt deliberate, as though the cold itself had a purpose. My breaths became shallow, and the dim light from the lamp seemed insufficient to push back the darkness. I forced myself to sit up. The urge to check the window was now a constant pull, gnawing at me from somewhere deep inside. It felt ridiculous to be afraid of something so mundane, and yet I couldn't bring myself to get closer. The curtain swayed ever so slightly again, and I could no longer dismiss it as my imagination. I glanced at the clock again. 11:57 p.m. I lay back down, trying to force myself to sleep, but it was impossible now. My thoughts spiraled, playing through every possible scenario of what might be outside. Maybe it was nothing, just an old hotel, playing tricks on the mind of a tired traveler. But there was something else, something more sinister in the air, that wouldn't let me shake the feeling that the warning was there for a reason. The noise started faintly, so subtle I might have missed it if I weren't already on edge. A distant, rhythmic sound like tapping, soft at first, but steady. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, and yet nowhere in particular. I listened, straining my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. My eyes moved toward the window. The sound seemed to be strongest there. I sat up again, staring at the heavy curtains. Something was wrong. That soft tapping was coming from the window, as though something, was trying to get in. My skin crawled at the thought. My logical mind told me it was impossible. There was no balcony, no ledge, nothing for anyone to stand on outside that window. It had to be the wind, the building settling. Still, the tapping continued, becoming more insistent. 11:59 p.m. I clenched my fists, sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at the curtains. It felt like a standoff now. Was I going to let some bizarre superstition control me? Was I really that afraid of what was behind a simple window? I stood up, my legs shaky. This was absurd. One quick look. That was all it would take. I'd proved to myself there was nothing to fear, just the parking lot or the street outside, and that would be the end of it. I stepped toward the window, the tapping stopping abruptly as I reached for the edge of the curtain. The sudden silence made my skin prickle with anticipation. My fingers hovered over the thick fabric, just a breath away from pulling it aside. Something in the air shifted. I felt it in my bones, a deep and almost primal instinct that made my heart race. Don't look. Mr. Calthorpe's words rang in my head louder than ever, but it was too late. My hand was already moving, pulling the curtain back, slow and deliberate. Midnight. The room's temperature seemed to plummet in an instant. The cold bit into my skin like ice, and my breath fogged in front of me. I could see the glass now, but it was different from what I expected. Instead of the clear pane I had imagined, there was a film over it, something greasy and thick, like a layer of grime or soot. I wiped at it, revealing only a small patch of glass, but what I saw on the other side wasn't the familiar sight of the parking lot or streetlights. There was nothing. A vast, oppressive nothingness. No street, no sky, no stars. Just an endless, inky blackness that stretched on forever. So deep and dark it seemed to swallow the very light around it. My breath caught in my throat. It was as if the world beyond the window didn't exist, like the hotel had been cut off from reality itself. Then the tapping resumed, louder now, more deliberate. My hand instinctively jerked away from the window as the glass trembled. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was on the other side of that darkness. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, watching me, aware of me, and it wanted in. The window rattled violently. Whatever was outside was no longer tapping. It was pounding now, desperate. A low, guttural sound seeped through the glass, a distant, hollow wail that filled the room. The pressure in the air intensified, like the room was contracting around me. I backed away from the window, my legs trembling. The curtain fell back into place, but it was too late. I had seen it. Whatever had been kept at bay by that simple curtain now knew I was there. The pounding stopped. Silence again, thicker than before. I stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do. My heart raced in my chest, the fear rising like bile. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. The room felt alive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, the lamp flickered, casting wild, erratic shadows around the room. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me. And then I saw it, the outline of something moving behind the curtains. A shape, tall and gaunt, pressing against the fabric from the other side. It didn't make sense. There was no balcony, no ledge, no way for something to be standing outside the fourth-floor window. But it was there, moving slowly, deliberately, the curtains shifting with its weight. I stumbled back, my body screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped by the sight of that figure pressing closer and closer to the glass. The thing outside stopped moving. The air in the room grew still again, but the sense of dread did not fade. My eyes were fixed on the curtains, waiting for the next sign of movement. Then, in the suffocating silence, I heard it. A voice, low and cold, whispered from behind the window. "I see you." Those 3 words, "I see you," echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls and sinking into my bones. My heart slammed against my chest, each beat pounding in my ears like a warning drum. I could still hear the voice, low and raspy, repeating itself in my mind. It was as though it had reached into the deepest part of me, leaving something behind, an awareness that couldn't be shaken off. I stared at the curtains, half expecting the figure behind them to push through the thin fabric. My body was still frozen, caught between the primal instinct to run and the sheer disbelief of what was happening. Everything about that voice felt wrong. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. I backed up slowly, my eyes never leaving the window. The air had grown thick with a stifling tension, the kind that wraps around you and won't let go. Every step felt deliberate, as though moving too quickly might trigger something worse, something that had been waiting for me to panic. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing closer. I wanted to turn on all the lights, to flood the space with brightness, but a part of me knew that wouldn't stop whatever had already been let in. It wasn't just the darkness that brought it. It was me. I had looked. I had broken the only rule. I reached the door, fumbling for the lock with shaky hands. The brass felt cold and unyielding under my fingers, and when I turned the knob, it didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but the door remained stuck, as if it were welded shut. "Come on, come on," I hissed through clenched teeth, twisting and pulling with all my strength. The handle gave a tiny, pitiful rattle, but nothing more. I was trapped. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My breaths came shallow and fast, panic clawing its way up my throat. I glanced back at the window, hoping, praying, that whatever had been behind the curtains was gone. that it had moved on. But the stillness of the room felt worse than the pounding had. There was no sound, no movement, just the unbearable silence and the oppressive cold. Suddenly, the voice came again, soft and far too close. "I see you." This time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was inside the room. I spun around, my eyes darting across every shadowed corner. My pulse was racing now, terror sending a cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck. The corners of the room seemed darker than they should have been, the shadows deeper, thicker. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Something was in here with me. The air seemed to shift, and I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, a shape. I turned toward it, but the thing had already darted back into the shadows. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe, but the darkness pressed in on me from all sides. "Stay calm." I tried to reason with myself. "You're just tired. You're imagining it." But I wasn't imagining the voice, or the tapping, or the rattling window. Something was here, and it wasn't going to leave until it had me. The temperature dropped again, so fast that my breath came out in visible puffs. The lamp flickered once more, casting wild shadows across the walls. I was certain now that something was watching me, watching and waiting. I turned my back on the door and forced myself to look toward the window again. The curtain hung still, but there was something behind it. I could see the faint outline of a figure, tall and unnervingly thin, like its limbs were stretched just a little too far. It didn't move. It just stood there, pressing against the fabric. "I don't want to see you," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible in the dead silence. "I don't want to know." The figure stirred, shifting ever so slightly as though it had heard me. My breath caught in my throat. What did it want? Why was it still there, just standing, waiting? The rational part of my mind screamed for me to turn away, to hide, but some dark, irresistible force pulled me forward. Maybe, I thought, I could confront it. Maybe if I pulled the curtain back and faced whatever was behind it, I could take control of this nightmare. Maybe it would vanish once I truly looked at it. But as I stepped forward, I felt the cold brush of air against my skin. The voice returned, louder this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. "I see you." It was coming from everywhere now. It wasn't just one voice. There were more. A chorus of low, raspy whispers, all saying the same thing, repeating those words over and over. "I see you. I see you." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the walls closing tighter, the ceiling pressing down. Every inch of the room was filled with that presence now, a suffocating weight that clung to my skin and pulled at my mind. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of the lamplight, barely visible in the gloom, was a figure. It wasn't behind the curtain anymore. It was inside the room, standing in the corner by the door, its face obscured by the shadows. My blood turned to ice. It was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin. Its long limbs hung loosely by its sides, fingers stretched out like they were reaching for something. But the worst part was its head, tilted, crooked, as if it was studying me, watching me with eyes that I couldn't see but knew were there. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed with fear. The whispers had grown louder, surrounding me from all sides. The figure took a slow step forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, like something that had learned to mimic human motion but didn't quite understand how it worked. It stopped just outside the circle of light, its face still hidden, and I realized with growing horror that I had been wrong. It wasn't that it saw me. It wasn't that it knew I was there. It was waiting for me to see it. It took another step forward, its long arms beginning to reach out. I stumbled back, slamming into the bedside table. The lamp rocked precariously, casting wild, flickering shadows around the room. I could feel the cold breath of the thing on my skin now, hear the faint rustle of fabric as it moved closer. Then, as if some final survival instinct had kicked in, I turned and ran for the door. My hand fumbled with the lock, and this time, it turned. The door swung open, and I bolted into the hallway, my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that whatever was behind me was still there, watching, waiting for me to look. And as I fled down the stairs and out of that cursed hotel, I could still hear the whispers. I see you. I was never one for road trips, but there I was, pushing through the winding roads of rural California, chasing an elusive deal for a client I barely knew. As Halloween night crept closer, the dimming sky began to reflect the exhaustion I felt. My eyes stung, and the cold ache of hunger gnawed at me. I needed to stop. That's when I saw it. An old hotel nestled on the side of the road, barely visible from the highway. Its neon sign flickered vacancy in washed-out pink, like a heartbeat in the dark. It wasn't the kind of place I'd usually pick, but I had no interest in driving any further. The world around me seemed to darken by the second, and I wasn't about to risk falling asleep behind the wheel. So, with a resigned sigh, I pulled into the lot. The building itself looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even longer, an architectural relic of a different time. The exterior was weathered, with dark wooden panels that looked like they hadn't seen maintenance in years. But the windows glowed with a soft golden light, giving the illusion of warmth. It felt oddly welcoming despite the isolation. Inside, the lobby was surprisingly quaint. A single chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a dull yellow hue over the space. An old grandfather clock stood ticking in the corner, its rhythmic chime adding to the otherwise silent atmosphere. At the reception desk, a woman stood behind the counter, her gray hair neatly tied into a bun. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, though her eyes were sharp and bright. "Good evening," she greeted with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Looking for a room?" "Just for the night," I replied, running a hand through my hair, still damp from the rain that had followed me most of the day. She glanced down at the ledger in front of her, as though verifying something unseen, then reached for a single key hanging on the wall behind her. As she placed it in front of me, I noticed her hesitate, just for a moment, before sliding a small folded piece of paper with it. Her fingers trembled as they withdrew. "This is for you," she said, almost too casually. I took the key and unfolded the paper. A list of instructions was neatly typed in faded ink. "Do not open the window, no matter what you hear. If you hear knocking after 2 a.m., don't answer. If you wake up at 3:33 a.m., stay perfectly still and pretend you're asleep." I glanced up at her, waiting for some explanation or punchline to the strange rules she'd just handed me. But her face was expressionless, as though none of this was out of the ordinary. I chuckled awkwardly, hoping to lighten the mood. "Is this some sort of Halloween prank?" I asked, folding the paper back up and tucking it into my jacket pocket. Her smile faltered. "We take the rules very seriously here," she said softly. "It's for your safety." A cold draft suddenly crept through the room, though no doors or windows were open. For a moment, it felt like the temperature had dropped significantly, and an odd tension settled into my bones. I brushed it off, nodding my thanks and accepting the key. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, making my way toward the stairs. As I climbed, the feeling of unease lingered. The hotel was quieter than any place I'd ever stayed. Not just the absence of noise, but the sense that silence had settled into the walls themselves, like an old habit. I found my room on the second floor, number 217, and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the room was small but clean. A neatly made bed with a thick comforter sat against one wall, and a vintage dresser with an old-fashioned mirror stood across from it. The window was draped with thick velvet curtains. Everything about the space felt strangely still, as if it had been left untouched for years, waiting for someone to return. I dropped my bag on the bed and glanced at the paper again. I had stayed in plenty of old hotels with their quirks and local legends. But this one felt different. I tried to laugh it off, attributing it to the exhaustion that had been building since early that morning. Still, something about those rules sat heavy with me, especially that last one. Stay perfectly still and pretend you're asleep? What kind of rule was that? Shaking my head, I tossed the note onto the nightstand and decided to freshen up. The bathroom, though tiny, was stocked with clean towels, and the water ran warm, which was more than I could have hoped for in a place this old. As the steam curled around me, some of the tension melted away. When I emerged, feeling a little more human, I noticed the window. The curtains hung limp, as though they'd never been moved. Part of me wanted to take a peek outside, just out of curiosity, but those strange words echoed in my mind. Don't open the window no matter what you hear. It seemed harmless, but the memory of the receptionist's somber face made me pause. After a brief inner debate, I decided to follow the rule. I grabbed a bottle of water from my bag, sat down on the edge of the bed, and turned on the small TV. A rerun of some crime drama flickered across the screen, providing just enough background noise to fill the void. The hours drifted by slowly. I found myself nodding off in the middle of the show, the day's exhaustion finally catching up to me. My mind kept wandering back to the list, though, its absurdity, its specificity. The room was quiet, but that kind of quiet where you think you're alone but can't quite shake the feeling that something, somewhere, is waiting. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 11:45 p.m. The moment I registered the time, a soft creak echoed through the room. My eyes darted to the door, but nothing was there. Then came another sound, like a faint tapping, from the window. I froze. The paper's rules popped into my head again. Don't open the window. The tapping came again, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to be beckoning me. Against my better judgment, I stood up and took a hesitant step toward the window, my heart pounding louder than I cared to admit. Don't open it. Just ignore it. You're tired. It's probably the wind. But the sound persisted, almost insistent now, like knuckles gently rapping on glass. Something inside me begged to look. And something else, something colder, warned me to stay where I was. I stood there, staring at the thick velvet curtains, every muscle in my body tense. The knocking at the window was persistent, steady. 3 taps, then silence. 3 taps, then silence. I could hear my pulse drumming in my ears, louder with each passing moment. It took everything in me not to reach for the edge of the curtain and pull it back, just for a quick glance. But the rules. The folded piece of paper sat on the nightstand, mocking me in its silence. I didn't believe in haunted hotels or cursed rooms. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to touch those curtains. It was a small, irrational fear, the kind that crawls up the back of your neck when you're alone in the dark, and every noise feels like it's meant for you. Logic told me it was probably a loose branch tapping against the window, or the wind throwing debris. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The taps came again, this time a little louder. I took a step back. "Forget it," I muttered, turning my back on the window. I would follow the rules, at least for tonight. No sense in tempting whatever ridiculous fate was supposedly tied to this place. The exhaustion I'd been fighting since the drive returned, wrapping me in its heavy grip. I sank into the bed, pulling the covers over myself as if that thin layer of fabric could shield me from whatever was outside. The TV still buzzed softly in the background, but I was too distracted to focus on it. The knocking stopped, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe, trying to let the tension seep away. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the kind of mattress that swallowed you whole and invited sleep. It didn't take long before my eyelids grew heavy, and the hum of the TV faded into the background, pulling me into an uneasy slumber. I'm not sure how much time passed before the sound woke me. 3 knocks. But this time, they weren't coming from the window. They were coming from the door. I shot upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark now, the TV flickering with faint light, casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The door loomed in the corner of my vision, an unmoving figure in the dimness. I stared at it, waiting for something, anything to happen. The knocks came again, low and insistent. I blinked, disoriented. The clock on the nightstand read 2:05 a.m. I swallowed the lump in my throat as I fumbled for the piece of paper with the rules, unfolding it with trembling hands. If you hear knocking after 2 a.m., don't answer. I squeezed my eyes shut, as though I could block out the sound entirely. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Some guest down the hall who'd gotten their hands on a second key, or even the staff trying to scare a clueless traveler. But the knock came again, harder this time. My hands balled into fists, knuckles white. I sat as still as I could, waiting for it to stop. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby downstairs seemed to echo up the stairwell, filling the silence between each knock. But with every knock, the noise seemed closer, as if the thing on the other side of the door was becoming impatient. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence descended once again, heavier than before. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The worst of it had passed, I told myself. I wasn't about to let some strange old hotel's rules spook me out of a good night's sleep. I lay back down, though sleep seemed a far-off possibility now. My mind raced, replaying the knocks in the eerie quiet of the room. Every creak of the old building made me jump. Every distant noise from the hallway set me on edge. It was all in my head. It had to be. At some point, fatigue won the battle against fear, and I slipped into another uneasy sleep. But it didn't last. The sound of the clock ticking brought me back, though it wasn't coming from the lobby this time. The noise was closer, much closer. I sat up, my ears straining to place the sound. It was still dark, the dim glow from the TV barely illuminating the room. My gaze flickered to the nightstand. 3:32 a.m. Then, just as the minute hand clicked to 3:33 a.m., I heard it. Breathing. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the sound of the TV, but it was there, just behind me. The unmistakable sound of slow, labored breaths, like someone standing at the foot of my bed. my entire body locked up in fear. I didn't want to look. I couldn't. Someone was in the room with me. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, to bolt for the door. But I remembered the third rule. I remembered it all too well. If you wake up at 3:33 a.m., stay perfectly still and pretend you're asleep. A chill shot down my spine as I realized what this meant. Whoever, whatever, was in the room wasn't just passing by. It knew I was there. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on the air around me. My breaths came in shallow, careful puffs as I lay perfectly still, my body stiff with fear. I forced myself not to move, not to open my eyes, no matter how much I wanted to. I could hear it moving now, slow steps shuffling along the floor. The floorboards creaked as it shifted its weight, moving from one side of the bed to the other. I could feel its gaze on me, watching intently. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I was afraid it would hear it. For what felt like an eternity, I stayed like that, frozen, paralyzed by fear. The breathing continued, deliberate and unnervingly close. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, willing myself to fade into the darkness, to become invisible. Then, the footsteps stopped. The room fell silent again. I waited, still rigid, every nerve on edge, expecting another movement, another sound. But none came. Minutes passed. I didn't dare open my eyes. Not until I was certain the thing was gone. The air felt lighter now, the oppressive weight beginning to lift. Slowly, cautiously, I cracked my eyes open just a fraction, peering through my lashes. The room was empty. The door remained shut, the curtains still drawn. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Except now, a strange sense of dread lingered in the air, like something had brushed past me and left its mark. I checked the clock again. 3:47 a.m. The thing, whatever it had been, was gone, but I didn't feel any relief. The rules, they were real. This wasn't some joke or local legend meant to scare gullible travelers. Something in this place was very, very wrong. And I was trapped in the middle of it. I lay there, the silence of the room pressing down on me like a thick fog. Every nerve in my body was still wound tight from what had just happened. The memory of that thing's breathing still fresh in my mind. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting something to move in the shadows, but everything was still. The clock on the nightstand ticked past 4 a.m. as I struggled to keep my breath steady. I was exhausted, but sleep was no longer an option. I had seen too much, heard too much, and now I had to decide what to do next. The rules were real. That much was clear. The warnings that had seemed like ridiculous superstitions only a few hours ago had turned into a lifeline, one that I was hanging onto by a thread. I had followed them so far, and as terrifying as the night had been, I was still alive. But the night wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming, something final. I pulled the crumpled paper from the nightstand, my hands trembling as I smoothed it out once again. The list was short, but each rule had proven itself crucial. And then I saw it again, the last one, bold and simple. Do not open the window, no matter what you hear. The knocking at the window from earlier had stopped, but now, with the hotel shrouded in an unnatural quiet, I feared it would start again, or worse. I clenched the paper in my hands, feeling its rough edges dig into my palms. I wasn't sure if I could trust myself anymore. I'd made it this far by following the rules, but my mind was playing tricks on me. Part of me wanted to laugh. How had I ended up in a situation where the only thing keeping me alive were the words on a piece of paper? I stood up and walked to the dresser. My reflection in the mirror stared back at me, pale and drawn, eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. The room felt stifling, as though the air had thickened, making it hard to breathe. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave the hotel, but the last rule gnawed at me: do not open the window. I glanced toward the window, its heavy curtains still drawn tight. There was no movement, no sound, just stillness. But I knew, deep down, that something was waiting. The moment I touched those curtains, the balance would tip, and whatever was on the other side would come through. Then, as if on cue, the knocking returned. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the glass. I froze. The sound was exactly the same as before, as if time had rewound itself to earlier in the night. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 knocks again. My throat tightened, and my hands balled into fists. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and listen to that horrible, insistent knocking. Then came the voice. Help me. I almost didn't catch it at first, barely more than a faint whisper carried on the cold air. But there it was again, unmistakable. A woman's voice, soft but pleading. Please, help me. My body went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I knew I shouldn't respond. I shouldn't even acknowledge the sound. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to follow the damn rules. But the voice, there was something in it that made me hesitate. It sounded so real, so human. Please, just open the window. The voice came again, barely above a whisper. I'm stuck. It's so cold. A rush of guilt washed over me. What if someone was actually outside? What if, against all odds, there was a person in trouble out there, trapped in the night like I was? I took a step toward the window before stopping myself. No, this wasn't right. This was the trick. The final trap. I turned away, walking back to the bed and sitting down, forcing myself to breathe slowly. I had to be strong. I had to wait it out. But the voice grew louder, more desperate. You don't have to be scared, it whispered, almost tender now. Just one look. Please. Just help me. I buried my head in my hands, squeezing my eyes shut. The knocking was louder now, more insistent. The voice rose with it, pleading and begging, as though the person on the other side was just inches away from freezing to death. But I knew better. I had to know better. Another knock. 3 more taps, each one louder than the last. The walls seemed to hum with the force of it now, and I could feel the vibration through the floor beneath me. The air in the room thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. Open the window. The voice screamed now, full of rage, no longer sweet and gentle. Let me in. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking slightly in place, desperate to drown it out. I didn't know what else to do. I just had to wait. If I could just hold out until morning, this nightmare would end. I told myself it had to. Suddenly everything stopped. The knocking, the voice, it all vanished in an instant. The room went silent, but not in a way that brought relief. The tension was still there, clinging to the air like a thick mist. I slowly lifted my head, opening my eyes. The clock read 5:03 a.m. Only an hour left. I could make it. I had to make it. But then, I heard it. The sound I had dreaded all night long. The window creaked open. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't gone near it. But it was open now, the curtains fluttering slightly as a cold breeze drifted into the room. My stomach lurched, fear twisting my insides into knots. Something had opened it. I stood, staring at the window, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The dark gap between the curtains felt like a portal, a void where anything could be lurking just beyond the glass. For a brief moment, I thought about running. Maybe if I bolted now, I could make it to the lobby, wake the receptionist, find some way to escape whatever had come for me. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Then I heard it. A low, slow exhale of breath, like something was waiting just outside. And in that breath, I knew there was no escaping this. Not now. The air in the room shifted, the oppressive weight returning, even heavier than before. The knocking had stopped, the voice had gone silent, but whatever was out there, it was here now. I could feel it, and it was watching. The curtains rustled slightly, the breeze catching the fabric as they fluttered softly, beckoning me closer. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, my body acting against my will, drawn toward the window. My hand reached out toward the edge of the curtain, and though every fiber of my being screamed for me to stop, I couldn't. I had to see. I had to know. Just as my fingers brushed the curtain, something outside shifted. A dark, indistinct shape, just beyond the glass. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time, I understood the real danger of breaking the rules. The voice hadn't been a trick. It had been a warning, a final plea for me to stay inside, to stay safe. But it was too late. I pulled the curtain back,